The Swiss National Bank promises multi-billion euro loan to Credit Suisse to quell market jitters.
As Israel is rocked by its 10th week of protests against the government's controversial judicial reform bill, the country's president calls for dialogue and compromise.
Transforming battlefronts to agricultural plots, farmers in Ukraine begin demining their fields for planting. Credit Suisse is to borrow up to 51 billion euros from the Swiss National Bank after it saw its shares sink by a record 24% on Wednesday. The move confirms an earlier promise by Swiss regulators to step in if necessary. The intervention came too late to prevent Wall Street taking a hit at the close of business, with the Dow Jones having dropped 0.9%. Confidence in global financial institutions have been triggered by bank failures in the US, starting with Silicon Valley Bank. The ripple effect has been a wider sell-off of bank stock across Europe, with Credit Suisse at the head of it. Customer confidence is getting shaky.
Là aujourd'hui, je vais suivre les nouvelles, je vais voir un peu comment ça évolue. Et oui, si je vois que ça empire, je considère le fait de éventuellement déplacer mon argent dans une autre banque.
Je pense qu'il y a un manque de confiance qui a conduit à cela. Moi, en ce qui concerne la confiance, pour l'instant, je suis confiante parce que en Suisse, je dirais, too big to fail.
Investors are expecting a bumpy ride over the next 24 hours, with Asia-Pacific markets seeing the Nikkei drop nearly 2% on opening due to the turmoil around Credit Suisse.
The impact of the Silicon Valley Bank collapse on the EU's banking sector is limited. That's according to the bloc's financial services chief. Speaking before the European Parliament in Strasbourg on Wednesday, Mairead McGuinness used Silicon Valley Bank as an example of why lightly regulated foreign lenders need to meet stricter rules inside the EU.
Thank you, President. Good afternoon. These US banks were not subject to strict regulatory requirements for liquidity because the United States does not apply Basel to mid-sized and smaller banks, while here in the European Union we do apply the Basel prudential standards to all banks. Had this been the case in the US and the Basel requirements on liquidity applied, it is likely these US banks would have had a stronger liquidity position.
The Basel regulations are designed to decrease the damage done to the economy by banks that take on too much risk. The European Commission says it's monitoring developments closely. One Dutch MEP, though, says the European banking sector is well equipped to weather a Silicon Valley Bank-like storm.
I am confident, however, that we have learned from the previous crisis. We've had a huge banking crisis in the European Union. We have built a new framework when it comes to banking legislation to avoid these crises in the future. And now we will see in practice whether what we have done in the past years is sufficient to prevent such a crisis from spreading to Europe. And I'm confident that this will happen.
Fallout from the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank isn't completely contained, though. Investment bank Credit Suisse has been hard hit, a much bigger concern for the global economy than the regional US bank. Shares of the Swiss banking giant plunged 30% to an all-time low, after its major shareholder Saudi National Bank said it wouldn't buy more shares in the Swiss bank on regulatory grounds.
Protesters gathered at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv and blocked the transport hub as opponents of the Israeli government's controversial judicial reforms gathered on Wednesday to demonstrate against the plan once again. The demonstration came ahead of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's official trip to Germany. Some placards read, "Dictator on the run" and "Don't come back." 10 weeks of nationwide protests have led Israel's president to call for dialogue and present a compromise plan.
המתווה שאותו אני מציג היום הוא שביל זהב שמכנס באופן ראוי, הגון, מאוזן ובונה את התפיסות, האמונות, הדאגות והחששות. הוא משקף את מרחב ההסכמות והמכנה המשותף הגדולים ביותר. זה לא מתווה הנשיא, זה מתווה העם.
However, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, whose government includes ultra-Orthodox and extreme right-wing parties, has already rejected the president's offer of compromise. The Israeli parliament has approved a bill in first reading that would, among other things, allow lawmakers to scrap Supreme Court rulings with a simple majority vote.
The all-too-common effects of war, death and destruction. The Kherson region in southeast Ukraine has been under sustained shelling at great cost. But when it stops, that's not the end of it. Local farmers are desperate to get back to work sowing their fields to feed themselves and the rest of Ukraine. But their ploughs keep tearing up unexploded ordnance after the soldiers are long gone. It's a dangerous and frustrating exercise. Andriy Litvinov, a farmer, says sappers helped him inspect his land and he still keeps finding shells.
Старалися своїми силами, щось трошки допомагали хлопці в свій вільний час, сапери. Було знайдено десь приблизно 300 зарядів, які хлопці збирали, ліквідували, взривали.
About 2.5 million hectares of agricultural land in Ukraine needs to be inspected for explosives. 800,000 of them are prioritised to start spring sowing. But mass demining requires special equipment. Ukraine needs to get it from international partners. On top of that, their farm machinery is broken. Parts to repair tractors are not easily come by.
Я с детства мечтал трактористом быть, пішов, нравится мені. Та якби розмінірували, хоч час поїхав. Помчався б вже, звісно, вже одвик трохи, вже хочеться поле.
Kherson's farmers hope to be able to sow about 30% of the agricultural land on the liberated territories on the right bank of the Dnipro River. It's not enough, but it's a start.
The die is cast. Despite widespread strikes and protests, the French Senate and National Assembly will vote this Thursday on the controversial pension reforms proposed by President Macron's government, after a commission made up of members from both bodies agreed on a legislative text. The regulations push back the minimum retirement age from 62 to 64, a move that the government argues will shore up the future of pensions and increase the number of older people in work. But these arguments do not convince everyone. In recent weeks, 3 million people took part in waves of protests across the country. This Wednesday, however, the numbers were down, with only hundreds of thousands turning out. Thanks to the support of the right, the reform will likely pass in the Senate and National Assembly. But Macron's flagship project has been rejected by unions, the left, the extreme right, and a majority of French voters.
The community of Oceanside, California is reeling after heavy rains from a winter storm triggered a massive landslide. Residents were evacuated from homes overlooking the Pacific Ocean coastline on Buena Vista. The parade of winter storms that have pummeled California have caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage as they washed out communities. Meanwhile, the U.S. National Weather Service is still issuing flood warnings for much of the U.S. West Coast. Over 350,000 customers are still without power in California as a result of the storms.
Yo creo que el punto de inflexión, como bien dice, con el asesinato de Mahsa Amini, ha removido la conciencia de los iraníes. Por eso es mujer, vida, libertad.
The death of 22-year-old Iranian woman Mahsa Amini on September 16, 2022, triggered a social uprising in Iran. And the resulting crackdown by the theocratic regime has been brutal. At least 137 people have been executed after being charged with participating in the protests. An estimated 300 to 500 protesters have lost their lives due to police violence, and more than 120,000 have been arrested since the demonstrations began. 6 months after the start of the crisis, what is the situation in Iran?
La población iraní ahora mismo ha dado un paso muy importante contra el régimen. Ahora bien, ha habido una represión muy dura que ha causado una especie de paralización de las protestas por el mero hecho de que ahora mismo salir a las calles te puedes estar jugando la vida.
Pero vemos cómo la forma de protestar ha cambiado.
The protests continue on social networks and in spontaneous acts by young people. After quashing the large mobilizations, the government granted amnesty to 22,000 detainees this week. But Bashande says the arrests are continuing and that the pardons are just a strategy.
La gravedad del asunto es que Irán es un país estratégico, es un país donde hay recursos naturales, sobre todo gas y petróleo, y hay muchísimos intereses en juego.
The European Union has condemned the violent repression and imposed sanctions on Tehran. But is that enough?
La firmeza en sí no pueden ser solo sanciones, tiene que darse otro tipo de políticas como podrían ser a lo mejor aislamiento diplomático, la expulsión de diferentes embajadores, como se ha hecho con Rusia.
Mahsa Amini died after being arrested by the morality police for allegedly not wearing her hijab correctly.
En Irán, la gente ha salido a protestar por la muerte de Mahsa Amini y dentro de nada se convirtió en una lucha pro los derechos de todos los iraníes y ha unido distintos grupos que hasta nada siempre luchaban por sus propios derechos.
Entonces, ahora mismo hemos entrado en otra fase, en una fase de desobediencia civil. Y eso es un caldo de cultivo para próximas crisis y sobre todo para próximos levantamientos.
Hundreds of Napoli and Eintracht Frankfurt fans clashed ahead of their second-leg Champions League round of 16 match in Naples on Wednesday night. The violence erupted as German fans without tickets arrived for the key match, which they had been banned from attending. There have been previous unrest between supporters during the first leg in Germany. Cars and motorcycles were set alight and some shops were damaged. Police and riot gear eventually managed to calm things down, getting fans to return to their hotels.